Why has trauma become such a buzzword?
I think there are a host of factors. There's not a great answer to the question, but there are, I think, a couple different things we can tease out. So it begins in 1980 with the formal creation of the PTSD diagnosis, and initially that was a very important historical development because it allowed people to treat trauma. The Vietnam War had ended years earlier, but none of those vets were able to actually get adequate treatment because there was no diagnosis. So the PTSD diagnosis was a big deal. But then a lot of books began to appear about PTSD, and it gradually made its way into the news. And PTSD is kind of a scary thing, right? An event that takes over in your life and you keep reliving it. It's a kind of a horror story in a way. And it's it's not a pleasant disorder to experience. But so the public is getting kind of a one-dimensional view about this, of what PTSD is. And, I think then the internet happens not long after that. And it makes perfect sense that online sources, both journalism and social media, they tend to put on there what we react to, right? What gets people to pay attention. Journalism, you have to get clicks. Social media has algorithms to tailor content. And all of those things tend to focus on disturbing content because that's what draws our attention. We're kind of wired to respond to danger. We're not so much wired to look at nice things. We do that too, but we're really wired to kind of from a survival point of view to react to danger. So suddenly these danger things are getting more and more presence in our lives, and that just kept going until people gradually began to get the idea that everybody's traumatized, everything is trauma. And I think it's starting to change now a little bit. There's a little bit of a correction been happening, but it's still fairly ubiquitous.
We naturally pair things: failure and growth, pain and healing, stress and coping. But with trauma, from my perspective, it seems like we just look at it in isolation and just understand it in isolation. And we rarely talk about it in relation to resilience, or even knew that that pairing went together between trauma and resilience.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Um, I I'm speculating. I've coined a phrase, the resilience blind spot, in part because trauma has a heavy emotional side to it. First of all, when we're exposed to what I call a potentially traumatic event. I try not to use the word traumatic as much as potentially traumatic, because events are not traumatic, they're potentially traumatic until we actually have trauma reactions. But most people will respond to a highly aversive, a life-threatening event with some distress and what we might call traumatic stress, which is really a kind of a very intense stress reaction that might involve nightmares, a few nightmares, intrusive thoughts. We're thinking about it when we don't want to. And our minds, I think, do that naturally as a way to help us adapt to those events. When something really dangerous happens, it's adaptive and it's a good survival strategy to make sure we understand what happened. So, we can maybe prevent it in the future, we can avoid it, or we can learn from it in some way. And I think our brains do that somewhat naturally. We're trying to get a better sense of the world, and our brains try to predict the world. That's basically what our brains do. And our brains are trying to predict the world that now has a very dangerous event in it that hurt us psychologically, even if it's briefly. So we might have to, our brains will repeat it a lot, and we'll kind of, think about it a lot. And those feelings, those come with very strong emotions too, like fear and other emotions. And when we feel emotions, it's well researched that when we feel emotions, we tend to think that they're going to last forever. It's hard to imagine that they won't last forever. So I think when we're in the midst of feeling the distress of having gone through something really horrific, it's almost impossible to think about resilience. It just doesn't seem to make sense even. I'm traumatized. And I know, people that in my personal life will ask me if I think they're traumatized or if I think they have PTSD, even if it's only been a few days. So I think those two are kind of, they don't feel like they're even compatible, when we're in the midst of feeling upset by things.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting thing about trauma, and you got at it a little right there, is we go into this internal reflective process of like, oh, is this trauma? Is this not trauma? Am I supposed to be feeling this way? Am I not supposed to be feeling this way? How do you define what trauma and resilience is?
Well, I define a potentially traumatic event, or I don't have a real hard, fast definition. I think a potentially traumatic event is something typically that involves violence or life threatening or real physical danger in some way. But that's a fairly fuzzy definition because lots of things come in relation to that. Then there's a broader category of extreme adversity, which might be like losing a loved one or divorce or financial problems, these things that are very difficult and frighten us and can invade our lives. Though that's what a potentially traumatic or a highly aversive event is. Then a trauma is, or a trauma reaction. There's traumatic stress, which is a short-term reaction. And then being traumatized really means that we're not getting over it, that a month or two more after that event, and we're still struggling a lot with that event. Then we're somewhat traumatized. And then we get in the realm of how long will that last? Professional help might come in then. And people who suffer chronic trauma are then people who for several years or longer are still struggling with that event. Resilience, on the other hand, I define resilience very operationally because I'm a scientist, right? So we track people over time. I can argue this point or discuss this if you would like. I don't think people are resilient or not resilient. Resilience is an outcome. We are resilient to something. So when something happens, if we show no lasting harm and we sort of return to our normal level of functioning within a short time of anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, we're like kind of more or less moving on in our life. That's resilience to me. That's the resilient. I call that the resilience trajectory. But so those are the basic definitions that we use in the research.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but a follow-up question to what you're saying about resilience there, is it like we get a taste of resilience and we get opened up to resilience, but that never becomes a part of who we are?
Right. Resilience is the way to talk about the outcome. And I don't think it doesn't quite work to think of resilience as what people have in them. People are not resilient. And the reason is because basically empirically, we've never been able to find it. Now, resilience is a word, just like trauma is a word. So when we know in English, particularly American English, we can't control words. Words become whatever people want them to be. But when we think about these things professionally or scientifically or in the mental health world, we do need clear definitions. Now, one of the things that I get into a lot in my recent book, The End of Trauma, is that there's a process. So I've been studying resilience for a long time and studying trauma and resilience for a long time. And we've identified this resilience trajectory that I just described. We've identified this over and over and over in response to all kinds of highly aversive or potentially traumatic events. And it seems to be, on average, around 2/3 of the population exposed to almost anything will show that pattern. So about 2/3 of people, on average, sometimes a lot more, sometimes a little bit less, will show that stable trajectory of healthy functioning. Then the other 1/3 of people, unfortunately, will show either long or short bouts with traumatic stress that go last a little bit longer than just a few weeks, and they have to struggle with that. But in trying to understand who is resilient and who not, or who is showing that resilience trajectory and who not, we've been stymied for a number of years because when there's a kind of a myth out there, I think, that there are a few key traits to resilient people. And you see this on websites, you see this in magazines, newspapers, and books. The key traits, the 5 key traits of resilient people, something like that. And that's kind of a myth because, first of all, we don't ever see people who are resilient. But when we look at those traits, those traits don't actually predict who will be resilient. And that's one big problem with that idea. Another big problem with that idea is that when we measure this resilient trajectory, when we identify people who show that resilient pattern, and we look at who they are, what their life is like, we don't find 3 or 5 or 7 key traits. What we find is 50 or 60 different features that correlate with that. So we just keep finding more and more. And if these are resilience traits, then there are 50 or 60 of them. And that's been the case for some time. And so if that's the case, then how do we make sense of that? What is a resilient person then? It's clearly not one thing, because there's too many different characteristics that have been associated with resilience. So eventually that led me to the idea of some other work I was doing, which seemed to fit very closely with this, which is what I call flexibility, or regulatory flexibility. We can call it flexible adaptation, that people adapt flexibly to these situations. And that's a set of skills that most people have, but you have to use those set of skills. So they're not just there and they work. There are things that we have to do. So we have the capacity to adapt. The human mind has the capacity to adapt. And that's really a nice feature of the human mind, actually. We are very adaptable creatures, much more so than many other creatures, for lots of reasons that I could get into if it's interesting. But that capacity to sort of flexibly respond to adversity is a key feature of human beings. And some people are more flexible than others. And some people have these skills and they're not even aware of these skills. But it's those skills that allow us to be flexible. And there's still the question of why isn't everybody flexible? Why isn't everybody resilient then? And that's a question that has a kind of a reasonable answer, which is that life happens. It takes us about 25 years for our brain to be more or less fully developed. And that's part of the reason we're so flexible. We have this long developmental period. But a lot can happen in those 25 years that make some people that make that stress response not quite as functional as it could be. So that's a long-winded answer to the question.
What are the biggest traits you've found for resilience?
Well, there really aren't any. This is kind of interesting. There are a lot of things that we tend to think are like sort of the top traits. Like, there's some things that are consistently associated with resilience, like social support, a network of supportive people, problem-solving ability, maybe positive emotion, maybe, emotion regulation skills. But none of these things really explain a lot. And that's kind of interesting. And in the language of science, the effect size is small. What that means in plain English is that if you look at a trait or a characteristic and then how well it predicts whether somebody will be resilient, it only explains a little tiny bit of that prediction. And that's called a small effect. And in fact, some colleagues of mine recently explored this a little bit, and they looked at 50 or 60 research studies that had measured resilience and had measured all these different predictors. And they found in some studies, a certain variable would predict resilience nicely, but in other studies, it wouldn't predict it at all. And still in other studies, it predicted it negatively. So it predicted less likelihood of resilience. And that really fits the flexibility idea really nicely. So if I put the flexibility idea a different way, I would say it's the ability to use the right behavior at the right time in the right situation. And that's another way to say that also, is that whatever the traits and characteristics we have work sometimes, and sometimes they don't work. They don't work in every situation. And I think there's so many myths layered on top of each other. There's so many misunderstandings. It takes a while to wade through all of this. But one of the key misunderstandings that's developed over the years with our sort of obsession with trauma is that there's this idea that any event that's kind of a generic idea of trauma, any event that causes trauma reactions is the same, right? So that these are traumas, and this category of traumas will cause PTSD. That's a widespread assumption. But in fact, if we think about it, even just for a little bit, say being caught up in a hurricane is extremely different, a very different experience than, say, being in a terrorist attack or being abused or being in an automobile accident. Each one of these things is a very different experience and presents us psychologically with a very different challenge. A very different set of coping skills are needed, and the aftermath is also very different, and the way it affects us is very different. So when you think about it that way, all of these different situations that we might find ourselves in that are maybe generically described as violent or life threatening, but the actual experience and the actual stress and the actual challenge it presents are dramatically different. So coping with them and adapting to them is also going to require different sets of skills or different traits and characteristics. So that's really why the effect sizes seem so small, because something works sometimes, but it doesn't work in other times. And flexibility is about figuring that out, about working that out. What can I do here in this situation?
I'm a big believer that the language we use within the medical space has a profound impact on our own personal well being. And that's because I've personally experienced that in the past. Why do you describe trauma as an invention?
Well, it is an invention. It was invented, or it was, it was created. It was thought up. We could have, used a different word. We could have come up with a different concept. I don't think that trauma doesn't exist. I don't think it, and I think it probably has existed for a long time. But it's kind of interesting that we only just got around to it and it's now about 45 years ago, in 1980. And if you look at the historical record, it's very interesting. We don't see mentions of traumatic events. We certainly see mentions of grisly events, violent and life-threatening events, but we don't see people talking about trauma reactions in the historical record until really for the first time. The first real good example was in the diaries of Samuel Pepys. Some people know what I mean by Samuel Pepys. Not many, though. Samuel Pepys was an aristocrat in the 17th century who, for 10 years, kept a diary. And he literally wrote about everything he thought and felt. And he wrote it in code, and he didn't really intend anyone to read it in his lifetime. And it was over 100 years after his death before anybody looked at those books, and then they had to decode them. They were in the libraries at Cambridge. So he was completely, utterly honest, all the way down to his hemorrhoids. He talked about his hemorrhoids, his farts. He talked about, his beliefs about race and all kinds of things in an unabashed way. And he was, because he was an aristocrat, the king had asked him to survey the damage during the famous London fire of 1666. And Pepys went around the city and he experienced the heat. He talked about it, how it's burning his feet. He saw the carnage and the damage. And for 6 months after that, he was still having nightmares about that fire that were keeping him from sleeping. And he was completely perplexed by that. And so that's one of the first accounts, but it's really interesting that was only appeared then because it was in code and he didn't anticipate anybody reading it. So it was kind of still a thing people didn't talk about, which suggests clearly that the people were having trauma reactions before they were talking about them. We just don't know when. And it's hard to know if we go back far enough that primitive human beings have trauma reactions. Probably, but we just don't know. I'm going to guess they probably did. But it wasn't until modern times that we sort of then decided to define it and make it an official diagnosis. So in a sense, we invented it in that time.
On an individual level, how much of trauma is narrative and story based versus physiologically based?
Wow, that's a great question. What would I say to that? There's definitely a narrative, an episodic component. There's definitely a story there, for sure. But what happens is it's also quite physiological, because there are biological things that happen when we're exposed to great danger. We have this very rapid, very intense stress reaction that happens that generally works quite well, but it's a physiological reaction. and it sort of takes over. We don't have to think about it. When we're under acute stress, one of the hallmarks of that kind of response is that things happen without us even paying attention to them. Our body just takes over. Whereas in other areas of life, we have much more volitional control. We have less so during these acute danger moments when our internal responses sort of go on automatic pilot. But then we do have a story to take away from that. But people who are traumatized typically have a kind of a very fragmented story. It's the fleeting images and sounds and smells and just this fragments of pieces of the event. And one of the ways, so they can't quite put it all together, part because it's just too painful. We're constantly pushing those images away. And one of the most effective treatments for PTSD, like things for traumatized people, is what's called prolonged exposure. And one of the elements of that is people sit down with a therapist in a very, very safe, controlled setting, and they tell the story of the event from the beginning to the end. And that's often for people the first time they've been able to do that. And that telling the story from beginning to end has a very powerful healing component because it allows people to kind of, put it into perspective. It happened in the past, and this is what happened. And there's often blame and guilt and all kinds of other emotions that are tied up in that people realize once they can actually tell the story from beginning to end. They sometimes realize it's not their fault, But so it's that fragmentary nature that's really characteristic of the trauma reaction. And so, in a sense, converting it into a story that we know happened and we can live with is what the healing part is.
Most people exposed to highly aversive or life-threatening events experience lingering short-term effects, a few days or even weeks of distress. These responses are perfectly natural. They indicate the fact that our stress response is hard at work, trying to help us adapt. And I think the reason why I'm so interested about that relationship between story and narrative versus physiology, for my own personal experiences, and not talking about trauma, but talking about chronic pain and physical pain. So I dealt with a lot of chronic back pain for 7 or 8 months, and no conventional treatments helped me. Just physically based treatments didn't help at all. And it wasn't until I started understanding the mind body connection and how I got into this mental wiring of just staying in pain that once I got that education and understood how to break out of that wiring, I got rid of my pain. Can that same type of understanding or same type of thing happen within this conversation in trauma? Like, can somebody have traumatic thoughts or feelings or feel like they are in this traumatized state more or longer than they should be just because they've gotten within that mental wiring and that perception of their state?
I'm not 100% sure I understand your question there.
I guess what I'm asking is, within my experience with chronic pain
Mm-hmm.
and physical pain, can the same thing happen with trauma?
Do you mean can people's awareness of their bodily reactions?
Not so much on the physical level, but I guess more so on the mental level. Like I was saying, like my mind was playing a role in me staying in pain.
I see.
So it's
Yeah.
like, can somebody's mind keep them within a traumatic state longer than they need to be?
Oh, I think so. There's a lot of pieces of evidence that have been coming out lately, like the for example, our theories about what a trauma is can actually affect how anxious and traumatized we become. Some people have a very broad conception of things that are traumatic, and those people are more likely to develop intense reactions to stimuli. There was some other research about trigger warnings. Trigger warnings became really popular. It turns out trigger warnings don't actually help much, and they sometimes make people worse. People show more anxiety when they receive trigger warnings compared to when they don't. But I think also the idea that people have conceptions about the abnormality of their reactions. And that's become a real thing lately, which I'm curious about, and I don't fully understand it. But I think knowing that the initial reactions that we have to highly adverse events or potentially traumatic events are adaptive. The passage you read just before, that was from my book, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to make sure I remembered that correctly. Um, and so, well, one of the reasons I mentioned that was because if we see, nightmares, intrusive thoughts initially as our minds trying to come to terms with what happened, it normalizes them. It makes them seem less threatening. They're more benign because we can think, okay, my mind is trying to figure that out. Maybe I can do that myself too. I can do it consciously to facilitate that process. Um, but so that, I think that's one healthy way to think about it. But the polar opposite is the fear of PTSD, and I think that's become a real thing where people are worried, oh my god, I'm traumatized, which only makes matters worse to have that fear. Like, I had a nightmare the other day, I'm traumatized, this is really bad. And so I think getting a little bit of a broader perspective on these kind of things and realizing that why our minds do that really helps, I think, and sort of destigmatizes and also makes it less threatening and less disturbing.
Yeah, it's that reactionary mindset that can make it a lot worse than it needs to
Yeah,
be for us.
yeah, yeah. Even there's, if I may say, one little thing that when you brought up chronic pain, and what's interesting is that there's all this research, it's kind of related research on inflammation. So when we have an injury and you have back pain, I've had back pain, I've had all kinds of other things. I'm clumsy, so I cut myself, I injure myself in all kinds of ways. And when you have inflammation, or when you have a biological invader, a bacteria or a flu or COVID, any of these things, we tend to get inflammation. And inflammation, this has only been known for a couple, less than 2 decades now. Inflammation sends messengers when there's inflammatory, when there's invaders, or there's an injury, or there's bacteria getting in, and there's an inflammatory response, an immune response. We get all kinds of messengers circulating throughout our body, right? To alert the body that there's danger here. There's something's here that shouldn't be. And inflammation is specifically a swelling of an area to restrict movement. But some of those messengers go to our brain, and they make us this seems to have evolved in humans, that we have these what are called illness behaviors or illness responses to immune messengers. It makes us feel lethargic and makes us feel like we don't want to be around other people. And knowing that really makes a difference. Knowing that, okay, I'm sick right now, or I'm injured, or I have back pain, and I feel sleepy all the time, and I don't really want to be around other people because my body wants me to feel that. My body's causing my brain to think that. And that really helps, because they say, okay, well, maybe I should rest more, and maybe I shouldn't be around other people now. If you don't have that, the opposite is to take that literally almost and think, I have no energy. I'm just a useless person, and I don't want to be around other people because I'm just I'm not worth being around other people. And people can make those attributions and become depressed because they've had an inflammatory response. So it's kind of the same ball game in a way. We misinterpret what our bodies are doing as some sign of our own failure, and that's really that sends people down the wrong road, I think.
100% the same ball game, and that resonates on a deep level. Knowledge and education for
Yeah.
me and for a lot of people within this space, within the mind body space, like that is the medicine. Like when you have a conscious awareness of what is going on within your body, like that is the true step to healing. Because when you're reactionary, you go into fight or flight mode, and that just makes things worse. But when you're able to detach and understand what's going on, you can kind of just be more at ease. And another great quote from your book on the resilience blind spot here: this kind of blind spot leads us to doubt that resilience can ever be genuine. We become suspicious. Where there is genuine recovery, we see deception. Where there is strength, we see weakness. Where there is optimism, we see only denial, and a dark future filled with hidden trauma symptoms lurking just below the surface. And I think that becomes a real danger within our society today, because trauma has become such a buzzword, and because we have such a it's just an everyday conversation.
Yeah.
We get into this framework and this narrative of like, okay, I should be feeling more trauma than actually feeling good. Why do you think we find more comfort in feeling bad than feeling good?
Oh, I wish I had an answer to that. There's a certain secondary gain to it. I think when we have a reason for who we are, that everybody has problems. Everybody has. I mean this truthfully. All of us have flaws and limitations. We're imperfect by design. I'm sorry, not by design, but we're imperfect as human beings. We're not yet fully cooked. We've only been on the planet in terms of the history of our the time span of the universe and our planet, a flash. So we've come a long way. We have a long way to go, hopefully, but we're still very flawed creatures. And then part of it is because we are, in a sense, still growing and learning, and we are flexible. So since all of us have flaws, which are sometimes difficult to own, difficult to accept, I think it's very convenient to say, well, I have this disorder. This is what happened to me. It happened to me, or I have this thing. It's not my fault. It's genetic, or So I've noticed this, that there's been an increasing tendency in the last decade for people to almost cling to diagnoses, which I've initially found very odd, and I think began to realize it probably because one of the main reasons, because it's an explanatory model. It's why I have these flaws, which may be comforting in the short term. I think in the long run, though, it's very maladaptive, because then we don't do anything to try to enhance ourselves. We stop trying to grow if we limit ourselves by a disorder. If we say, I'm traumatized, that can't do anything about that, or I have ADHD, or I'm manic depressive. And none of these disorders were ever meant to be life sentences. They're descriptive. They're meant to describe what somebody's experiencing at the moment. But particularly in the US, we have a tendency to do this, I think. Even intelligence, the intelligence test came from France. Alfred Binet, started measuring intelligence. And his goal in doing that in the 19th century, mid 19th century, his goal in doing that was to help kids in school by defining where they were at that moment, and where they might be best placed in schools. When that was imported to the US at the early 20th century, it immediately became a genetic kind of permanent level of intelligence. People were defined as having a level of intelligence, and we translated it from a temporary state to a defining characteristic of who you are. If you had a low intelligence at this point, that's it. That's what you've got to work with, which is a completely literally foreign to the way the idea was first conceived. So we have a tendency that I'm not sure why we have that tendency, for the reasons we just talked about, but that seems to be a characteristic we could do without, I think.
I don't think there's a cut and dry one way or the other answer to this question, but how much of this comes down to the system failing to give us the tools and the proper education and understanding of trauma versus it being up to the individual to look beyond that and take things under their own control?
That's an interesting question. Well, from my own experience, I teach a large lecture class of master's level students, about 200 master's students in an auditorium. And at the beginning of each semester, it's a one semester course. It's a lecture course, but I get very animated. I walk around on the stage, and I have the class ask me questions, and I ask them questions. So we get a little bit of a discussion going. At the beginning of the semester, every year, the class comes in each year more and more with these very rigid ideas about trauma. Some of the things we've talked about just now, the idea that trauma, everybody's traumatized, that trauma is hard to get rid of, that it's for any of the things that we've just talked about. And it requires a whole semester of my going through all the literature, presenting all the science, questioning all the assumptions and gradually bringing them to see, here's what all of this research, there's mountains of research, and here's what it shows. Most people are not traumatized. Most people are actually resilient to trauma. Most people get upset for a very short term, and it's adaptive, etc. All the things we've been talking about. And it takes people about a semester, which is about what, 4 months or so, to kind of undo all the societal assumptions, which are very rife right now. These misunderstandings about trauma are everywhere in the social world now. I don't think it's the system as much as, I think you use that word, the system. It's really, I think, this is going to sound like an old fart. I'm going to sound like an old fart here. I think it's the internet. And I don't think I don't think the internet is evil, or I don't think it's some malicious thing. There's some malice on the internet. The social media companies, I think, the powers that be, they are definitely feeding people unhealthy material because it makes them oodles of money. Definitely, that the algorithmic way social media works makes people oodles of money, whether it's unhealthy or not. But the internet, we're all trying to. I think we all have to grow up about the internet. We have to learn to what it does to us and how to use it effectively. But otherwise, it feeds us these mythical things. We just did a research study. One of my master's students, Bailey Schock is her name, and she did a fantastic job with this. We did a study on TikTok, and TikTok has a lot of people use TikTok, and TikTok has tried to install constraints about the use of words related to suicide. But people love to talk about trauma on TikTok. It's just too enticing, but it's also monetized. There's something called trauma dumping, and that's where people tell their trauma stories on TikTok. And then there are sites that gather all these things together in one place, and viewers flock to these sites to listen to people talking about their traumas. And there's advertising involved. Those sites generate a lot of advertising money. So TikTok then banned the use of suicide-related words, with the exception of people with sort of validated mental health credentials could talk about suicide. Because people like to do this so much, people started using what's called algo speak, which are words that allow you to talk about suicide and get past the censors, like unlive or suicide, or there are a host of other ones. And so what we did is simply look at transcripts of a bunch of these videos and code whether they had used algo speak or not. Some videos were able to talk about suicide and evade the censors by talking about suicide. And it turned out when people are using algo speak, they were generally the least healthy videos you could watch. They had the least sort of positive healing qualities to them, or whatever that would mean. They were really more of just sort of sensationalistic trauma stories. And so, our desire is to watch these things, to listen to these things, as what we were talking about before. We're wired for threat, and there's a purient kind of interest in it too, and a kind of like this, I think something similar to horror movies, or something viscerally exciting, even if it's unhealthy. And we have to learn about that. We as humans have to learn about that and try to titrate that. And I think right now is a great time in history to think about that, even in terms of the current political climate. One can be very upset. Anybody can be very upset of any political persuasion by going online, because you can find somebody telling you what some horrible thing somebody in the team that's not you did, right? And so I think it's very important, even for people who want to read the news and educate themselves, to titrate how much they look at just the internet for this stuff.
So much great stuff to unpack there.
Yeah.
I actually had that observation on my own, just going through TikTok, and not specifically to trauma or suicide, but just problems in general. I came up with almost like a category for that. I call it woe is me content.
Yeah.
Where it's so easy just to talk about your problems and your struggles. And like you were talking about, people can grow big followings. They can make money off of it. They can get all this engagement on it. And from a brain wiring standpoint, you're like, ooh, I like that. I get a dopamine rush when I'm getting thousands of likes and thousands of comments of people just relating to my problems. And so I'm going to continue to do it. And I find it really fascinating about what you said with your teaching, where it's like a big part of your job is, okay, I need to unteach what they've learned,
Yeah.
and then I can actually teach them the truth on this
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I don't know if I would call it the truth, but I would call it the scientific reality or the empirical reality. But yeah, it is it is taken that shape of unlearning the sort of assumptive world out in the floating around out there.
What are your thoughts on loneliness? Because that's also become a buzzword within our society, and you see all the time. You see articles. Speaking of the internet, I mean,
Yeah.
you search for loneliness epidemic, and you'll get a lot of
Yeah.
content on it. What are your thoughts there?
I think loneliness is a real thing. It's a problem, but it's not a it may be overblown because we're living in virtual worlds now more than we used to. However, it depends very much on the people involved. I've been involved in four or five, no, maybe three or four. I may be exaggerating. Internet studies now, but some internet studies with a lot of really interesting data. And what we find is that the internet is not all bad or all good. The internet is harmful for some people and less so for other people. And even when we talk about the internet or social media, there are a range of different ways you can interact with the internet. There's entertainment, there is violence, there is pornography, there is social media, there are educational things online, there's news. So there's a whole range of these things, and each one of these things has an educational versus a violent or a prurient content. So what we found is people who are, say, we looked at one study of sexually abused girls, and they looked at more pornography and more violence. And that was really that to unhealthy levels, right? But then if we look at other groups, we find that social media is associated with, say, depressed people. But then there are lots and lots of healthy people who are looking at the internet also and not having any of these problems. So it depends on the amount that people use it, and it depends on what they look at. And so, it really varies. And I think there's a lot of good on the internet. And even in terms of loneliness, and a number of people have said this. I've seen this in published papers of people talking about the social capital of the internet. That people will, connect with other people in ways that are not possible in person. My son is a good example. My son spends hours and hours on the internet. And of course, as his parent, both my wife and I were very concerned. And he was developing these friendships on the internet. And a knee-jerk reaction we had was, well, those aren't really friends. It turns out they are. And these internet friends on the internet, these friends on the internet lead to actual interactions in real life. And incredibly powerful, supportive interactions. So I think that we don't want to underestimate, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and underestimate the fact that the internet has the power to be a kind of way an expansive social world too. And so I think the real question we should be asking, and I don't think there's enough research or enough people asking this question, is what makes the difference? Like, when is it bad and when is it adaptive? When is it healthy and when is it unhealthy? What's healthy and what's unhealthy? Those are really the questions.
Couldn't agree with you more in the way that I view it as well. And agree with you. It's more dangerous to be cut and dry, seeing things as black and white, is like, okay, this is good or this is bad. The way that I see it and what has really helped for me personally is like, okay, what does my relationship with this look like?
Mhm.
Like, social media isn't bad. It's the relationship with social media that you have that can be good or bad. And I explain that to people. I'm like, just because McDonald's exists, does that mean just food in general is bad? It's like, no, it's your relationship with food. And I'm the same way when it comes to podcasting or a lot of different things. That is all stemmed from the internet and social media and emailing people. And that's because I'm like, okay, I've developed a good relationship in that sense with these tools.
Yes.
Whereas in the past, it's like, okay, I am consuming too much bad content. And that was a large reason why I wanted to create a podcast, actually. I was like, this is a medium and this is something that I can do that can allow my relationship with media, the internet, whatever it is, evolve in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Makes good sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Talk to me about the difference between searching for meaning and problem solving when it comes to trauma.
Well, searching for meaning is a curious one, a curious turn of phrase. It's generally seen as a very good thing, searching for meaning, but that phrase itself is kind of ambiguous. Um, what we found in our research is that people who do pretty well, who are resilient to highly adverse events or traumatic events, potentially traumatic events, tend not to do a lot of searching for meaning. They're not trying to explain what happened; it just happened, and they're just trying to get on with their lives. And I think probably there's a time course to it. So searching for meaning initially. I'm sorry, what was the other phrase? Searching for meaning, and what was the other phrase you said?
Searching for meaning and problem solving.
Problem solving. Okay. So initially, we want to figure out what's happening to us, and so we talk about it a lot. There's a lot of research that shows people talk about potentially traumatic events, adverse events, a lot in the first week, and then that tapers off. So we continue thinking about it, continually looking to explain it. Why did this happen to me? We're going to end up ruminating on the event because there often are no explanations. Um, an example, I had developed a very, very painful nerve problem in my face. It's a nerve coming out of the brainstem that innervates the face. And it was like I'd have these periodic lightning bolts in my face. It was horribly painful. And I never knew it was going to happen. It's extremely rare. It has a name, trigeminal neuralgia. And it happens in 1/3 or 1/100th of a percent. It's some very, very tiny number. And now, of course, the simple question to ask is, why did this happen to me? I'm a very healthy guy. I live a good life. I eat well. I exercise. I do all these things. I try to reduce stress. Why did this happen to me? And the answer is no answer. There's no explanation for that. So if I continued to ponder that, it would have really, I think, only made matters worse. So searching for meaning, I think, is like something we do initially, and then we kind of, we either realize there is really no meaning in this, or the meaning is life is difficult, and otherwise I'm going to just move on. So continuing along that line only, I think, gets us into trouble. Problem solving is also has a time course to it as well, but typically we try to figure out, if there is a problem, what is the problem that this presents me, and what can I do about it? And sometimes we find ourselves in kind of thorny problems. Say we're having difficulties in a relationship, or think of the people in California who lost their homes in these fires. What do we do now? Insurance is going to go up. These houses burn. Climate changes happen, and so there's more fires are likely to happen. What should we do? And that's a problem that we could devote a lot of resources to solving, and a lot of people are devoting time to solving those problems. And that would suggest there's a time limited quality to it. But if then we continue to worry about it, or some mix of finding meaning and problem solving and stretching that out over time, then we could start again to think about it too much and ruminate on it. And some problems can't be solved. You say, okay, I can't do it. There's nothing that can be done here. I'll move away, or I'll rebuild in a different place, or I'll build a house out of, I don't know what, concrete or something like that. But so, yeah, I think that's the time plays a big role in those things.
Confidence in coping motivates in a different way from optimism. It can give us that little extra push we need to be more adventurous. When we feel confident that we can handle ourselves, we will likely try a broader range of behaviors. We might even try behaviors we are not sure we are able to do, simply because we assume ourselves likely to succeed. I'm a big believer, and largely because I've experienced it, hard times, especially against our will, break us out of our shell. And for a lack of better term, I kind of call it, we develop a fuck it mentality for life, where
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, I'm going to go after it. And that's a common theme that I've found with a lot of the people that I talk with on the podcast is they've had some type of unwilling suffering or challenge that they've been faced with. And that's actually been the thing that's catapulted them to go on to do the great things that they've done in their life. What are your thoughts on that?
On what? On what? On being.
Just that whole understanding of how these, whether it's trauma or just challenging things in general, can be the thing that really catapult us forward in life rather than holding us back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's entirely plausible. I think that trauma or really difficult events don't always have to lead in any kind of personal growth, but I think the way they do lead to growth has to do with our realization of our capacity to deal with things, our sense of mastery, and how it can open up our sense of possibility. Um, there's something I call the flexibility mindset that kind of gets at that idea. It's where you mentioned confidence and coping and optimism. Those are all kind of components of what a flexibility mindset, where we have a sense of, all right, this happened. I didn't want this to happen, but let me just get on with it and deal with it as best I can. And the more that we do that, the more that we get a sense of, I'll deal with things that happen, and I can do more than I thought I could, perhaps. And so that means I can try some things I maybe didn't think I could do. Or I'm stronger. I'm more capable of enduring things than I realized. And so I think the opening up to broader horizons or accomplishing things has a lot to do with this, how it expands our sense of what we're capable of.
Something that really helped me going back to healing from chronic back pain was meditation, or what I
Mm-hmm.
like to call talking with my brain, and something that naturally just I got into the habit of doing was thinking and talking in third person and
Mm-hmm.
seeing myself or just detaching from my identity. Can you talk about the benefit of distanced self talk?
Yeah, I think that's really great stuff. Actually, a lot of this comes into the work of Ethan Kross, who did some of the
Yep.
nice research on distance self-talk. I think self-talk in general is adaptive. It's useful. It's something we do naturally anyway. Often when we do self-talk naturally, it can be negative, where we say to ourselves, "Ah, you dummy." Or, and we might even use distance self talk. We might just say, I would say, George, you dummy. Oh my God. And that's usually not very effective unless we do it with some humor, maybe. But self talk in general, sports psychologists, educational people, lots of different people have learned to capitalize on self talk, which is essentially condensing our inner dialogue into a few words. Lots of the dialogue is constantly running in our brains as we try to make sense of the world. And we can, when we do self-talk, we condense it down into a few words, like, and it can be positive. And so we can attempt to do this deliberately, like, I can do this, I'll do this, I'll get it done. It's going to be okay. We can do all those things. And then Ethan, and I don't know if he discovered this but he certainly did a lot of the great research on it. Ethan Kross showed that distance self-talk is even more helpful because it puts a little bit of a buffer between us and the event, as if we're watching it. So when distant self-talk would be like, um, I might say to myself, George, you can do this, or any kind of thing where I'm actually commenting on what's happening rather than being part of it, and it just gives us a little bit more of a sense of, I don't know what, it's less immediately dangerous if there's a little distance. Yeah, it works very nicely.
That's played a big role in my life. And like you were saying, it started with me with the meditation and talking with my brain, but then that has gone into so many different areas of my life, especially with my work or different projects. It's like I sense it as like I'm not the one who's doing it. I'm detaching, and like Tim is the
Uh,
one who's doing it, and I'm kind of like the one who's controlling the video game sticks.
that's really interesting. I love that. Yeah, I like it.
There's another duality and relationship that you don't talk about in your book or within this conversation on trauma, but I think is really fascinating and I think could help people. and that's consumption versus creation. I see trauma as being something that can consume you, but creative expression and artistic expression can be that balance to that where it's like, okay, I need to release something. And you talk about that a little in your book with different case studies where it's either one person painting or simply just writing emails and sharing the experience and sharing the story. How do you think creative expression can help people?
Oh, I think creative expression is fantastic. It's not necessarily for everyone, but I think it's not necessarily for everyone, but I think everybody is capable of some creative expression. It's a matter of sort of letting go and just being willing to make something in a sense, if you will. So if so, say I mean, I paint and draw, and I appear to have at least some talent. I don't know how much talent, but I can do some. I can actually do some things that look like conventional paintings and drawings. But I remember when I first got into psychology, way back when before I even had an undergraduate degree, I didn't go to college till I was 26. So just as that was beginning to happen, I got very interested in Carl Jung. And I wanted to do an independent study when I first went to college at 26 in Carl Jung. And I went to the university and people were saying, well, I don't know, nobody really does that stuff anymore. Maybe you can, there's a Jungian analyst in town. Maybe you can do an independent study. And I did with a man named Ira Sharkey, who was fantastic. It was a life-changing experience. Actually, he was very good. He had trained in Zurich at the Jungian Institute. But one of the things I did in that we started off as an independent study, but it was so clearly a kind of a therapy. I just continued with him to his agreement for 3 years. But one of the things I did was to write down my dreams as much as I could. And when you start doing that, you remember more. And dreams are kind of a strangely creative thing because you realize how your mind is symbolizing everything. But then I would do things like spontaneously paint things, having no idea what they would be, whether it was attractive to look at or not, or just make something that seemed like I liked it and bring it to the sessions. And those outpourings had so much meaning when you put them in context. So it's kind of helps with artistic expressions and creative products to have an audience because then you get some reaction to it. But you can do this. We can also do this obviously with ourselves alone, just expressing something. And it can be anything that works for anybody, a piece of art, a poem, even just a few words we say to ourselves when out walking, some way of representing something in a way, because a lot of this artistic expression or creative expression kind of happens with less conscious control, right? The more we can let go and just let our minds do something without worrying about it too much. And then when, subsequent, we can look at it and we can see what did our minds produce. And it tells us a lot. It's also a kind of a nice release that it gives us a kind of a bonus of kind of a flexibility in how we can think to it. It broadens our sense of the way we can understand ourselves, I think. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if how well I justified that or what kind of an advertisement I made for it just now, but I think it's really an important part of experiencing the world.
I think that was great. And just one point to add on top of that, of what you were saying, you kind of get into this unconscious state where it's kind of just happening. I had Stephen Kotler on last week, who I know you've talked with him in the past from Flow Research
Oh
Collective,
yes, yes.
and creativity, great for flow state.
Yes, totally. Yeah, it really is. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really nice link with the flow state. Yeah, absolutely.
How can we go about allowing ourselves to feel our pain while not losing sight of the fact that we can't attach ourselves to it?
Feel you mean our psychological pain or our physical pain?
I guess both.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't like physical pain very much.
Same
I
here.
I know. I mean, I spent a number of years meditating. Not so much anymore, but I still spent a lot of time reading. I spent a great deal of time reading Buddhist literature, which I really enjoyed and still do. Um, and there was an idea that I remember being really struck by, and then I found out it really does work. Is to actually instead of fearing pain, to kind of almost embrace it and literally focus on pain. And when you focus on pain, it has a strange way of diminishing, and what we talked about before is highly relevant about understanding how our bodies work and how our mind body connection works, educating ourselves around that, because you quickly realize that pain is created by the brain. It's not in the body. It feels like, and there's a cut to your arm, or I burn my arms a lot because I go upstate in New York State and make fires all the time in a wood burning stove, and it gets very cold up there, and I'm always reaching in that wood burning stove and burning my arms on the side of the stove because it gets very hot. But if you think about it, there are the body will attempt to heal that burn right away without you even having to pay attention to it. But there are pain receptors that send signals to the brain to create the experience of pain. It's the same way with body temperature, all kinds of other things, and emotion too. The body's doing it on its own, doesn't need us paying attention. It's wired to do that. But we've evolved awareness of these things because it's effective. So pain is effective because it tells us that we've injured ourselves. And there are two kinds of pain. There's an immediate pain, which has very fast neural connections instantly. So we pull our arm away, say. Then there's throbbing pain and slower pain neurons that just remind us that there's still an injury there. And though, if you think about those things as signals that your body that have evolved, so they're in your brain to bring it to your awareness, it gives it a different flavor. It's not so much like this horrific thing that I'm experiencing. It's what you're experiencing is only your brain creating that experience. And that's a really, really, I think, helps tolerating it. It helps understanding why it's happening. Yeah, it really does help, I think.
George, I think that's a beautiful concluding point. Where can people go to see more of your work who are interested in diving more so into your research and everything that you do?
Well, I have two books for the general public. The Other Side of Sadness, which came out in 2009. I updated it in 2019, which is about grief and bereavement. And then The End of Trauma, which came out in 2021, which is about most of the things we've talked about today. So The Other Side of Sadness and The End of Trauma. I publish a lot of articles because I'm an academic. I have websites. If anyone Googles my name, those websites will come up. And often those articles are available to download on those websites. I give a lot of public talks, or a lot of videos online. And if anybody writes me or sends me an email, I'll do my best to try to respond. I sometimes can't, and email gets the best of me these days, but I'll do my best to respond also.
Awesome, George. Great talking with you today.
Great talking with you, Tim. Thanks.